Well, I'm joined with Evan Kenny as we're looking ahead to the NFL draft later this week. And Evan, some few topics to talk about. We'll get to the obvious one, which is the quarterbacks, in just a little bit here. But the surprising storyline of the draft, or I guess one of them, is the lack of defensive prospects there is this year. I mean, there are a few guys that stand out, but normally we see guys in the defensive range that usually are in that top five. So I guess why is there not a lot of defensive prospects this year?
Yeah, Connor, you're 100% right there. Just even, you mentioned the top five. Looking at that top 10, it doesn't really seem like there are a ton of, high-end defensive prospects when it does come to that top 10. Patrick Surtain, too, and J.C. Horn as well, Micah Parsons. Those are kind of those top three guys, depending on what teams are looking for. Depends if they want a cornerback or a linebacker in those positions. Connor, it's not as much, I guess, that there's a lack of this defensive depth. There's just more offensive skill in this draft class. Like you said, we'll get to it in a couple minutes here, but the quarterbacks and the wide receivers are just out of this world when it comes to this draft class. So, obviously you're picking those players ahead of these defensive guys. Connor, just looking at past drafts here, last year, half of the picks in that top 10 were defensive players. Going back to 2019, 7 of the top 10 were defensive players. And then in 2018, only 3 of those top 10 were defensive players. But Denzel Ward was taken 4th overall, sort of to counteract that, unlike this year. So it will be a little bit different this season versus past years.
Yeah, and of course, we'll obviously talk about depth as well later on. But of course, you're right. It's all about what a team needs. Now, speaking of what teams needs, there's several teams that need a quarterback, like the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are expected to take Trevor Lawrence 1 and Zach Wilson from the Jets at number 2. But the story begins at number 3, Evan. There was, at the beginning of the year, it was Justin Fields. Now, getting towards the draft, it's leaning towards Mac Jones. Where do you see the number 3 slot going? Where do you see who's going to take number 3, or which quarterback's going to go at number 3, as where is some of those other guys ranked down in the first round?
Yeah, Connor, you mentioned Justin Fields, Mac Jones. There's also Trey Lance sort of as that third horse in this race. Now, Trey Lance, in my opinion, isn't quite at that same caliber that those other 2 quarterbacks are at. And when it comes to those other 2 quarterbacks in Fields and Mac Jones, is basically what kind of quarterback does your team need? Now, the San Francisco 49ers, with that 3rd pick, they gave up a lot of capital to move up there. They gave up the number 12 pick this season in 2022. They'll give up a 1st and a 3rd round pick. And as well in 2023, they're also giving up a 1st round pick. Now, Connor, in my opinion, when a team's giving up this much and has this much at stake, they're not drafting a quarterback similar to the one they have in Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, that's sort of a pocket passing type quarterback. No offense to Mac Jones, but that's exactly what Mac Jones is. I just don't see him getting taken here. Justin Fields, to me, is the more interesting prospect, especially at the number 3 position with San Francisco. You got to remember, San Francisco was absolutely plagued this year by injuries. They're not nearly as bad as of a team as this number 3 pick, or even, in my opinion, the number 12 pick that they originally had. So Justin Fields gives them a great element of being a mobile quarterback, but he also gives you similar numbers to what Mac Jones does. Now, his completion percentage is lower than what Mac Jones's was this past season, but if you look over, their entire career throughout the NCAA there, I would say Justin Fields has been the better quarterback. Connor, another issue, I guess, with taking Justin Fields at that number 3 position there, Ohio State quarterbacks have not panned out, especially as of late. So NFL teams will obviously be watching for that, and, it will be obviously a question. But for me, if I'm the San Francisco 49ers, I'm taking Justin Fields with that 3rd pick.
And it's going to be interesting to see if they do take Mac Jones at number 3 and how far, I guess the storyline is going to be if they take Mac Jones at 3, how far will Justin Fields fall to 15, maybe to the Patriots, who are contenders to trade up as well, maybe the Broncos. That I know they've had time to look at Trey Lance as a potential pick there as well. But just on the last topic here, Evan, before we wrap things up here, we talked about depth, and there's lots of great offensive depth this year, lots of great wide receivers available, lots of great offensive tackles. So talk about some of the guys that really stayed out to you and could be some really good picks that aren't quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, Connor, when you talk about offensive depth, wide receiver. First thing that jumps off the page, there's three high-end wide receivers in Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, and Devontae Smith. I mean, all three of these guys could arguably be a #1 receiver in the future for any of these NFL teams. I mean, let's first of all talk about Jamar Chase. Last season, he opted out of playing, but he was a part of that national championship team in 2019 with LSU. And Connor, on that team, you had Justin Jefferson, but Jamar Chase was arguably your best receiver. I mean, his hands and just being able to get up and get a ball over defenders is like none other in this draft. Now, talking about Jalen Waddle, he's an electric player. This year, he was injured, was limited to just 6 games, but in those 6 games, he averaged 21.1 yards per reception. And as well, we've been able to see him do things on his own that, a lot of players aren't able to do, whether that's, punt returns, kick returns. He's able to score in multiple ways there and can help a team in multiple ways. And then finally, Devontae Smith. I mean, it's not very often, that a wide receiver wins the Heisman Trophy. It's been almost 30 years since that happened last, but Devontae Smith was able to do that. We might not even see him go as the top receiver while being the Heisman Trophy winner, just showing how deep this class is. Devontae Smith has had a historic career here at Alabama, whether it's, leading different categories in the SEC or even all-time categories in the NCAA. He's a fantastic route runner, which is his #1 characteristic. The downfall to Devontae Smith is his size. He's only about 170 pounds, and when you're going against cornerbacks who could have up to 40 pounds on them, it is a little bit of a worry there. But nonetheless, all three receivers are fantastic. And Connor, that's even without us talking about tight end Kyle Pitts, who's almost just like a glorified receiver in my mind.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens on Thursday night. The draft is always exciting to watch. Evan, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Connor.